We are currently at a 72% recertification rate for our members this year, which is higher than it was last year. And I know those are numbers actually from the end of October. So we'll have 2 more months of additional people getting recertified. And so I'm sure that number will go up even further. So good job, everybody. And I appreciate you putting forth the effort and all your volunteerism. Very nice. That's all I have.
Okay. And we thank you, Carla. Carla has been the membership director now for 2 years. We'll be moving up to president. And I publicly thank her. She's done a tremendous job of working as the membership director, and it's going to be big shoes to fill, but we'll find someone to do that. She will. She's going to have to find her own replacement. So good luck on that. We wish you the very best. Katie, are you here? Is Katie on? Did she log in yet?
Also, I've been looking at the roster of the participants, and I haven't seen her name pop up yet.
Yeah, I don't see it. I have Amy's bio here. I apologize, Amy, for not having Katie here to read this and introduce you. But Elsa, shall I go ahead and well, actually, do you want to talk about the?
Is our speaker? Has he joined us yet?
Amy, the speaker, is here.
Amy,
yes,
she is. I see her.
But do you want to make any announcements about the volunteer appreciation celebration?
All right. That's on December. I'm not going to be able to attend. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to miss that nice party that's going to be outstanding. Everyone's going to want to be there. I just learned today they already have signed up. 91 people are planning to attend the volunteer recognition party. There was an article in the newsletter, and this is on November the 3rd. Is that right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
December 3rd. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, December the 3rd, and it's at Camp Capers this year. So check out the newsletter to get further details. You will need to let them know which kind of meal you want. There are vegetarian meals available, but you will have to make prior arrangements for those and make a reservation so they'll know how much food they're going to need.
Thank you for all that, Elsa. I just had
there you are.
Getting in. They were updating Zoom.
Oh my goodness. Okay,
let me interrupt real quickly because I don't think Katie knows, but the date is Saturday, December the 4th.
December 4th.
The 4th, not 4th. 3rd.
All right.
So,
yeah.
Katie, go ahead.
You wrote down 3rd, correct that.
Yes.
Katie, go ahead. You've got plenty of time and just give a good detailed report on that day.
Yes, we have over 90 people registered, and the meal is paid for by some board donors for those that are active members of Hill Country Master Naturalists, and you could bring a guest. The guests will be paying the $18 that it costs us for the meal. There will be a silent auction, which usually is pretty popular. And as Elsa said, we've got over 90 people signed up. This is a beautiful place. It's an Episcopal camp for kids, and it's on a bend of the Guadalupe River in Welfare. So it's really not very far from either Bernie or Kerrville. And I sent out the directions once, and I will do that again before the day that we start.
Can people still sign up?
They can. We're going to close the signups the day after Thanksgiving. We need to get them the numbers. So you've got until the day after Thanksgiving to sign up. I hope you will all come. It's a wonderful appreciation of all your hard work from the board. And we try to do this every year. We were not able to do it last year because of COVID. And we're going to recommend that you wear masks. You don't have to if you object. The room is very large. It has lots of doors that open to the outside. And the grounds are beautiful, so you can get out and wander around. We're going to have some awards. We're going to have some music from Mr. Habitat, Bill Oliver. And I think you'll really like the whole setting. So I hope everybody will sign up.
Elsa, you're muted.
Yeah, sure am. We didn't know how long the voting would take, and so we're running a little quicker than what we thought, but our speaker is online. And so Katie, just go ahead and introduce our speaker, and we'll just proceed from here.
Thank you, Elsa. I am thrilled to have Amy Hardberger here with us. I read an article in the San Antonio paper probably a year ago in which she was talking about the problem that happened during the freeze, and that we think a lot about whether we're going to have enough water to drink or to water crops. But lo and behold, an incredible amount of water is used to run the power plants. So that is a serious issue. And the article that I read that Amy had written was about the fact that the power sources and the water sources really don't communicate enough. So Amy was at one time was working for the San Antonio Water District, who they're very aware of water issues because they've got such a large population. I think that we here in Kerrville forget about it because we have this lovely big river out here, and sometimes there's a drought, but it just looks like we have enough water, and our water comes from the river. But that is not a common situation for most people in Texas, and we've been in and out of drought forever. Amy Hardberger is a teacher and a writer employed at the Texas Tech School of Law right now. It's the Texas Tech Center for Water Law and Policy. And if you remember when you were in class, we talked a lot about the issues of water law because they're so conflicting. And it's the opportunity for lots of legal conflict about that. Then she worked for the Environmental Defense Fund and led partnerships with cities and state agencies on water conservation projects, the relationship between energy and water and sustainable water planning. Amy has a BA and an MS in geology, and then she went and got her Doctor of Law degree from Texas Tech, and she's a professionally registered geoscientist in the state of Texas. So I'm very pleased to have her come and talk to us about the state of water for us in Texas. I'm particularly interested in this issue because I grew up in Southern California, and there used to be a river there, and there is no longer a river in San Diego. So I think that we need to be very alert and pay attention to these water issues and be ready to go out and advocate for our water situation. So Amy, thank you for coming and being on our Zoom.
Sure. Thank you.
Someday, if you're ever in Kerrville, we'll feed you sometime.
I'll be driving right through there day after tomorrow, but I'll be like on a mission. All right, let me see about sharing. I was told that I probably will be able to. Oh yeah, it's popping right up. So I am going to be talking today about the energy water nexus, but if you have other water questions that I might be able to answer, feel free to ask them. If you want to drop anything in the chat during while I'm talking, that's fine. I'll get to those as I go. I've gotten pretty used to trying to field chat questions popping in. After teaching online for a year and a half, I'm quite happy to be returning to the classroom live in January. And then I'll leave plenty of time at the end also for question and answers, because I find that's often the not only the more helpful, but easier to pay attention to than somebody just talking. So, as was mentioned, there is a relationship between energy and water. So I wanted just to start by talking about that and going through it. A lot of folks, this isn't something that they spend a lot of time thinking about, which is why I think the winter storm was so interesting. A lot of people sort of, I heard a lot of people talking. I am on the board of trustees for San Antonio Water System. So I was getting a lot of phone calls and texts saying, well, first we're out of power and now you're turning off the water, as opposed to you're losing water because we lost power. And the op-ed that was referenced was, something that I felt like really needed to be captured in the aftermath of the storm, to try and, once again, start a broader conversation about the interdependency of these two areas. So we have quite a few energy sources that we get energy from. Everybody here, I'm sure, is well schooled in understanding the various types of, whether it be coal-fired power plants, solar, natural gas, wind. Every single one of these has a water footprint. So whether it be in the manufacturing of a wind turbine, or the water that it takes to get the power from one place to the other. Of course, most people, when they think about the energy water nexus, they immediately think about hydroelectric, and that is an obvious one. That's true. We don't have much of that in Texas except for small sources. And so a lot of folks think that, if you lived in the Pacific Northeast, if you have a low snowpack year, then there are obvious concerns about the ability to manage the electric supply. But down here, where we think about coal-fired power plants, we often don't recognize that relationship. But it's the same with nuclear, it's the same with natural gas, it's even the same with these large solar arrays. So really starting to think about water in our energy sources and our energy production wherever we're located is sort of the beginning of the conversation. So, looking at the generation by source, this is a slightly older graph, so we may have somewhat less coal, but in Texas, we actually have a very high renewable portfolio, as many of you know, higher than the national average in other states, mostly through wind, and we're seeing a large build out of solar in the far west Texas area. We actually have a pretty heavy natural gas load compared to some places. That really provides a lot of opportunities in the climate change sphere, because we've actually already gotten off of not fossil fuels, but coal itself. Other states that you may have looked at, they might have in their portfolio upwards for 70 or 80% coal-fired electric. So for them to get away from that as baseload is much more challenging than here in Texas. So, how do we use water for energy? So for folks that haven't thought about this outside of a hydroelectric type scenario, as I mentioned, if you look at these main fuel types, natural gas, coal, nuclear, and solar, and again, I'm looking at large solar arrays, not necessarily the photovoltaics you'll have on your roof. Water is used very directly in the combustion process. And so whenever we think about energy generation, we first think about, well, what is the fuel that is creating the energy? And then we look at sort of the cooling technology, which is actually what creates the energy. So in these cases, you can have in these different areas, you might have one fuel type uses a lot more water on the front end, but they're using a water efficient cooling technology on the back end. So if you can think about this in almost like a mix and match type scenario, that's how we understand what each individual power generator might be using. And I'll go through some of these technologies in a minute, but other water needs that we might see if we're really trying to capture the full water footprint of energy production includes the mining side of things. the transportation, whether oftentimes that's train, and then fabrication, which isn't on here, which probably should be on here. You know, what is the water footprint of fabricating wind turbines and things like that. There are also there's also a water footprint that we often don't capture very well, and in this case in particular, it's evaporative losses. If you live near a power plant or have even driven near a power plant, you might have noted a lake or a pond nearby. That water is subject to evaporation just like any other, you know, open water source in the state of Texas, particularly in the summer. And in many ways, more so because the water as it exits the wind turbine is going into those ponds as heated water, and so often its evaporative losses are even higher. And I just got a question about biomass plants. If you're burning biomass plants, you will also see water, because the purpose of how the energy is actually generated is that you have some kind of a fuel that is heated or burned that then creates heat. Water is boiled, and it is actually the steam that is turning the turbine. So it's less about the fuel type, even though there is a water footprint in the fuel type itself, and much more about the cooling technology. So when we think about open loop cooling, that water is only passing through the cooling one time. Closed loop will capture it and keep reusing it. So obviously then you're adding in maybe some additional water. Dry cooling or air cooling uses the least amount of water, but we don't really see that here in Texas because our humidity is too high for that to work, and that just essentially uses air. And then we have this hybrid cooling. So even in something like a biomass fuel type, we would see a water footprint based on the cooling technology itself, and also perhaps the collecting, etc. So this first number sort of jars a lot of people, that almost 1/2 of all of the U.S. freshwater withdrawals are for power generation. So that's not consumption. One thing that we really need to make sure that we understand in terms of terminology is withdrawal is how much water is needed for it to run. So that's sort of the amount we're pulling out. Consumed is water that isn't being returned immediately in the back end for immediate reuse. So, you know, you might have, you could have a large amount of withdrawal and a small amount of consumption. So that would be the water that we would lose to steam. The water that gets put back out would be available for another user immediately. Now, it would be a different chemistry because it's just been raised to very high temperatures, and it might be of a different temperature, but it's available. So it's not that 50% of all water consumed is for power generation. That said, if you're thinking about energy reliability, the fact that it requires that much water, I'm sure you can see ahead to where I'm going. If that water is not available during a drought year, you will be threatening your power reliability. So in Texas, now take these numbers with a grain of salt, because one of the biggest issues is that we don't necessarily meter all of the water that's going in. So I, along with Michael Weber at the University of Texas, when I was at EDF at the time, did an analysis of trying to quantify the energy water footprint of Texas. This was back in 2010, I believe. And what we found was we had to estimate quite a bit based on how we knew a power plant functioned and how large the power plant was. So even 11 years later, we're not seeing a lot of increased data collection in these areas. So obviously that's one of the biggest challenges right out of the gate is really understanding exactly how much we need for these things. So for water consumption in Texas, power plants are only 2% of the water consumed. So for downstream users, that's actually very, very good news. But again, what we're focused on here is more the power reliability piece. And as I mentioned, we have these data gaps, both in terms of how much water is being pulled out for the power production, and also how much are they losing just in evaporative losses. So that would be an easy thing to measure, kind of easy. You figure out how much comes in, how much you're putting back in your cooling pond. And a lot of that, in the difference of the two would be evaporative losses. But again, there's not any kind of requirement for power plants to report that. So if we're trying to assess what our risk is, it's quite hard to do when we don't know exactly how much is needed. So this is just the capacity of power generation in Texas power plants, and you'll see that the water consumption for Texas power plants, you could basically overlay these two. So wherever you have a generating facility, you're going to have some water consumption. Now, the size of the dots may be different, although generally speaking, the larger the power plant, the larger the water consumption. Even if it's a once through cooling technology, you would expect higher evaporative losses in a larger power plant. So a lot of us near us, in these major populated areas, I think that we could all predict that we're going to see a lot of power generation near or relatively near populous areas. The one sort of exception to that, I guess, would be wind arrays that are often in West Texas, and those are not power plants. Those are they get moved to, well, I guess each one is an individual power plant. And then over time, we may see this map changing a little bit as these large scale solar arrays really start to increase in the far West Texas area. There's only one or two at the moment. But if you look at ERCOT's projected energy production for the next 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of it's heavily reliant on solar, which has I can tell this group other major impacts on open lands, wildlife corridors, and things like that that are often not looked at, but we won't be talking about that today. We're focused on water, but I'm just throwing that out there. So where is it that we are, so sort of flipping to the other side, where is the energy needs for water? And this is really where we saw the disconnect, no pun intended, during the winter storm. We need energy to pre-treat water. Now in San Antonio, for people who might live in San Antonio or are drinking Edwards water, we are very lucky that that water does not require a lot of pre-treatment because it's extremely clean. If you're closer to the Austin area or you're being served by surface water, you would need that to be pre-treated. So clean to drinking water quality standards before it goes to your home. Then it takes energy to pump it to your house. When we're talking about the hill country, we're often pumping uphill. So that's an added energy requirement. Then when it gets to your house, you are personally using power to heat your water, whether it be in the shower, the dishwasher, the washing machine, etc. And then there's energy needed to pump the water from your home to a wastewater treatment plant. And then we have another very large energy footprint as we treat the wastewater so that it can be discharged. So oftentimes that water is not being treated to drinking water quality standards. In fact, it's quite rare for it to be go back to potable water. But if you live in an area that has a purple pipe system or a gray use system, then it's being pumped to a quality that's permitted for that, or often it's being discharged into surface water. So again, not drinking water quality standard, but definitely requires some treatment. You would not want black water, that's what we call sewage water, to go into directly into a river body. And I know there are lots of issues in the hill country with wastewater discharge permits from summer camps and other large built out facilities that think that it's not a bad idea for them to discharge directly into creeks and streams. There will be an energy footprint if those permits require treatment. And then, of course, we do use energy if you're using irrigation. Cities are not the only folks that are using energy for their water, although we are one of the main ones because of the need for drinking water quality standards. So that often takes quite a bit of power to do that. Unfortunately, we have even less data on this side. So what we do know is that in most cities, in fact, I probably would say all cities, but the lawyer in me wants to say most just because I really don't know every single city. The water utility is the power company's greatest customer and vice versa. So in San Antonio, CPS's largest customer is San Antonio Water Systems, and it's the same the other way around. So we have these very critical relationships that we need to focus on a little bit more clearly, I think. So again, if you look at surface water rights in Texas that cities have, you see a pretty clear overlay on wastewater treatment plants. We would expect those two to overlap. So just again, the main takeaway here is really looking at where all these are located so that you can quickly assess where the risk areas are in either times of drought or supreme cold or extreme cold, which is what we saw, and what we may see again based on climate change models that are coming out. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in the winter storm. I don't mean to sort of trigger anybody's PTSD, but it was very cold and somewhat traumatic for those of us who did not have power. My house did not have power for 4 days. Luckily, I was in West Texas in one of the few houses that did still have power. So I actually got off much better than a lot of my friends and my actual neighbors. Many of you may have struggled with this. What we saw across, so this is from the New York Times, who did a pretty detailed article after it happened, a post-mortem. As you can see, Central Texas and the Hill Country was where the power outages really started, but they quickly grew across Texas and covered all of Texas with the exception of the Panhandle, because the Panhandle is not serviced, or at least parts of the Panhandle are not serviced by ERCOT. So the larger US grid didn't go down, even though it was equally cold up there, whereas Texas struggled. And it's pretty striking to look at, these are not hours on one day, these are hours over 4 days. So even Thursday, we started to see outages on Sunday. By Thursday, we were still seeing outages again in the Hill Country. So where it started was sort of one of the last places to get their power back. So how does this relate to water outages? Well, it varied wildly depending on where you were. So I'm going to focus on San Antonio as an example because I have the most information about that because I was closely dealing with it. So San Antonio had some pretty significant outages. Everything pink here was out of water as of February 18th. So you can kind of overlap it with this. What is not showing on this is the amount of people in the center area, so the white area, that had significantly reduced pressures because those folks were just happy to still have water. But if you were to do a different map, which I don't have, unfortunately, and look at everyone within the San Antonio area or the SAWS service area that was impacted, whose water supply was impacted, I think it would be almost the entire map. And so a couple of things happened, and it's important to understand where the triggers were. Some was very obvious. There were areas where power was cut that a lift station or some sort of a supply area was within that. So there was literally no power to move the water. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this map is, for those of you who are familiar with San Antonio, that entire northern quadrant is uphill. So that's really where you start the Hill Country officially starts. San Antonio is really in the middle of about 5 different topographical areas of Texas, and the northern part and the north to the northwest is the beginning of the Hill Country. And so that's really where we have a real reliance on power in order to be able to get water up to these areas. If you're in the downtown area, you're relying primarily on gravity flow. So even if the power goes down, SAWS can get you some water. Now, the other issue that happened, and a lot of people are unfamiliar with this, is that for a water system to work, it can't just have some water in the system. It has to have a certain pressure to be able to function. So there has to be a certain amount of water for it to work. Well, what we found was the combination of power being cut and lines breaking. So whenever you get a line break, whether it be a large one, like a large main, or even the break to your house, when you total that up, it significantly changed and decreased the pressure that was in the system. So for those of you who were living here, you may remember that this all ended with a boil water notice. And that's because according to federal law, if we can't guarantee a certain amount of pressure, then we can't guarantee a certain quality of water. And so the insult to injury at the end of all this was that then you had to boil your water and you might not have any power in order to be able to boil your water. So I saw people on camp stoves. I had friends that were boiling water in pots on a grill out in the snow. Everybody was making do. But ultimately, this water outage or even your service being impacted was a direct result of a power failure and or a power reduction. So, so what? You may believe that we're never going to see another winter storm like this, or at least not in our lifetimes. And that may be entirely true. But this relationship is still critically important in hot periods of time, which I think we are all very clear that we will experience again. So here are some maps of the projections of what we are going to be faced with in Texas. Obviously, there are varying models and they all say different things in the specifics. But in general terms, Texas, as well as everybody else, but particularly Texas, please note, these are the number of days that will be over 100 degrees, which makes me want to throw up a little bit and find the lightest yellow area and move there. And you can see that we're already very much on that trajectory. The lower left hand shows how many days above 100 we've had since 1970. And that is a very clear upward trend that is not stopping anytime soon. So, heat alone is not the problem. It's heat and rainfall or lack of rainfall, but also when we get our rainfall. So if you're thinking about needing to have a reliable power generation, you not only need enough water, you need that water to be of a certain temperature. Note that those are called cooling technologies. So if you have very hot water, which often happens during low water years. So if you have a drought, you have less water, the sun is going to heat the water faster. That means that water, even if you have the right quantity, is not going to have the cooling capacity that it would under normal circumstances. Then you're in trouble. And the bigger issue is you may not even have enough. So while in the summer storm or the winter storm, what we saw was power shutting down the water supply, what we can easily see in summers, and we almost saw in 2011, for those of you who might remember, is a loss of a power grid because of lack of water, which then will shut off your water. So the thing about the energy water nexus is you can either have a positive feedback loop where one is assisting the other, so you almost have kind of this leveraged enhancement, or you can have a negative feedback loop where they are damaging each other, which is why, by the way, if you ever want to conserve water, one of the best things you can do is turn your lights off and vice versa. And that's something that a lot of people don't really realize. We don't talk about it in this way. So if we look at, yet sort of, this is from GRIST, and they sort of took pictures and took the climate models and made them into pictures. And you'll see in Texas, just to the west of us, we have this desertification. And then in many parts of Texas, we're going to have these extreme flood events. So even if we get the same amount of rain on an annual basis that we're used to, we may get it in these very large pulse events, which we are seeing more and more of over the years. And so how does that work if we're trying to figure out having enough water consistently for power generation? Should we be figuring out ways to capture that? Right now, we get these kind of pulse flows down to the bays and estuaries, which is great and necessary. But if it starts happening more frequently than historically, it might not actually help the bays and estuaries. It may get too watery down there, or at least too fresh watery. And we're losing the opportunity to have that water for other purposes, like energy generation. This is a slightly older map from Circle of Blue that talks about sort of projected water shortages over the next decade. You can see that we are definitely predicted to have not just a regional, but a statewide shortage. So what does that mean for power generation? On top of that, our energy consumption is not staying static. The more people we have, if we don't really think about conservation and efficiency, the overall demand will go higher. This is the projected water demand from the state water plan. This is all available online at Texas Water Development Board. Cities really are one of the biggest challenges because you have such a high concentration of people in one area that must have power and water service to it. You don't get this kind of, so that means if one system goes down, a lot of people are affected. If you live, it was interesting to experience the winter storm in a very small town in West Texas where people were able to assist each other. You don't really see that in a larger city. You may have been lucky and seen that in your neighborhood, but to be in a town where there's, a sort of a chat list where people are saying, I have power if you want to come charge things, or I have hot water if you want to take a shower. You can do that on a micro level. It's pretty hard to do that on a macro level. We use water a lot of different ways in Texas. What we're focused on here is steam electric, which is the second from the bottom. But also municipal water demand includes in it energy. So that is just the lower line is just the power generation. But if you're really trying to understand the energy footprint of water, you need to also think about what portion of the municipal water usage also has embedded in it energy. And one of the things that we're seeing all over Texas is more and more of a shift of conversation to large water pipeline systems. So really thinking about, well, it's not that we have a shortage of water, it's that we don't have water where we need it, when we need it, and the solution to that is to move it there. There can be advantages to that, and I don't think that Texas is going to grow at the level that we think it's going to, or it's projected to go to, without moving water around. But please know that the energy footprint of these large water pipe and transport projects is immense. And it is very, very concentrated in the areas through which the pipeline runs. And so it's quite easy to think about building one of these, and that usually the initial conversations are about, okay, we're comfortable that there's enough water here and to make this system work, but what we often don't ask is, yes, but is there enough power? And if we hook up this pipeline, is it going to drain the power in this area? And even without shortage, if you get to a place that there's not enough power in that area, that they have to build another power generation supply, it's going to tax the local water area. So again, it just kind of goes and goes. And we're not the best at thinking proactively or preventatively, just as a culture. We're terrible at it. These are the projected shortages by use type, also from the Texas Water Plan. Note that steam electric has a pretty high uptick of shortage after the 2050, 2060 projection. Part of that is because we are projected to need much more power generation for new populations, and if new generation means more water to run that generation. There are a few solutions here. The easiest one is that these sectors start planning things together. That should happen both at a city level, but also at a state and even federal level. At a city level, places like San Antonio and Austin are better suited to do this because they have a municipality for both. So it's quite easy for them to talk to each other. We don't have deregulated power. If you're in a city where, it's like your cell phone provider, you can choose, or even a rural area where you can choose your power provider, it becomes much more difficult because it's disaggregated to allow that power provider to be able to plan with the water provider. So we can do it at the generation side. So if we're constructing new generation, we should be requiring each of those generators who are trying to build a facility to submit a 50 or a 100-year water plan of how they're going to get the water, which would include assessing who the current water users are and how they might be affected. When I was working for Environmental Defense Fund, there were several coal-fired power plants that were slated to go up in East Texas as part of Governor Perry's fast-tracked power plants. You may remember this. They ultimately weren't built, but it was very interesting to see it from the side that they located these power plants based on the proximity to rail lines, proximity to, inexpensive land, and they never once considered where they were going to get their water. And local residents were excited about the potential of some new jobs, and nobody was really thinking about whether their water resources would be impacted, just due to a lack of understanding or knowledge that was what was going to happen. So there's a lot of the planning, in my opinion, needs to be done on the front side. So if a large pipeline is going to be built, we need to have a very complex and clear energy plan that is available for anybody who wants to look at it, to figure out if we're going to use all the generation in that area and force new generation to be built. Conservation and efficiency in both sectors. The beauty of the positive feedback loop is if you save in one, you save in the other, which then helps you save in the first one again, and back and forth we go. So that's important. Peak shaving is also really critical. If during the winter storm, people had on whole put there was a lot of bad decisions that were being made at the state level for sure. But in situations like that, whether it be on a very cold day or a very warm day, if everybody were to change their thermostat a little bit, then the power doesn't go down and then the water doesn't go down. So for those of you who really read a lot about the power shortage after it happened, we were within 4 minutes of crashing our entire grid, or maybe less. I mean, it's the scariest. If you look at a minute by minute understanding of it, it will definitely shake you to your core. So, everybody, the collective, the issue with both the power and the water side is we never, at the moment, we don't need that much all the time. We only need it on very, very cold days and very, very hot days. Unfortunately, that's when we need that resource the most. So for example, on a very, very hot day, that's when we're using the most air conditioning, which then can crater the power. So you can do a lot to sort of pull out these issues just by managing the peaks. So when we have these very cold days, and we are, as a culture, not great at responding to requests. We are often about our own comfort. I even saw that on my own street, where the people across the street had power and their heaters were cranking away, even though the people across the street did not have power. And within 4 hours, their power was gone too, and suddenly they were complaining. So, the collective decision-making is important. And I believe that for people to understand this relationship might help the decision-making. And then anything we can do to mitigate climate change would be helpful, so that we have fewer of those hot days or fewer long-term droughts. But the one thing I can guarantee you in all of this is we will be faced with similar challenges in the future, either in the summertime or the wintertime. So that's my presentation. That's my contact information. Feel free to contact me at any time. And then I'll stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions. I really don't know if I talked too much or not enough, but there you go. I wasn't timing myself, which I probably should have been. Bad speaker. This is what happens when you're a professor. You just stare at the clock, and if I don't have a clock, I don't, pay attention.
Wow. That was a lot of information presented in a way to get us thinking about things we hadn't thought about. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can't think of a question you didn't answer that had ever hit me on all this. I'm just, wow.
Yeah, you'll think about it. It'll percolate. So Katie asked, why doesn't the cooperative planning happen? I mean, I probably have 50,000 answers for that. I mean, some of it is politics, the exact same reason that we didn't see any real movement on grid reformation during the legislative session, even though immediately after and during the winter storm. Some of it is a bit less nefarious. It's really because these sectors were always planned separately. And so it's easy to say they should be planned together, but in reality, it is very difficult to do. The plants are in different places. You might have a power plant that services really large. I mean, if you think about a power plant, I don't know how familiar everyone is with how ERCOT works, but power generation is fed onto the grid, and then it's batched out by ERCOT at the cheapest first. So that's why wind always goes out at night. But if you think about a water supply, at least historically, before we start moving water all around the state, historically water is very, very local, almost hyper local. And so it's just, and then you also have different people supplying water than power. These are totally different entities. So thinking about how we would do cooperative planning is pretty challenging. So it's much easier to do it prospectively than retrospectively. So that's why my focus is always to get folks on new projects, whether it be new power generation or new water facilities, whether it be a pipeline project or wastewater treatment plant, to really think about what the footprint is of the other sector and make sure that at the very least, you're not creating unintended consequences. So there's a lot of reasons there's not joint planning. Those are probably the biggest ones. It's much, much, much higher. So water demand for power generation outpaces the energy industry by a significant amount. First of all, a lot of the power that's used in the energy industry, particularly in the gas industry, they use their own product. So they will take a portion of the gas and they can use it for their energy needs. There are far more power plants than there are oil and gas plays. If you think about every single person has their lights on right now, in Texas. So it's night and day. So power generation is, as I said, takes about 50% of the water, withdraws about 50% of the water in the entire country. Let's see. The PUC sent a survey. Whoa, you just completed it. It's a local electric company, PEC. They asked if we would turn off electricity when we were asked, do you think we've had enough? No, I don't think so. I think that, it's very, very interesting to see, being from San Antonio and growing up during the Edwards Aquifer legal battles and the amount of education that has gone into water conservation in San Antonio. The result of all of those years of investment is that when we ask people to conserve, they do. So when we get into drought restrictions and a news alert goes out and says, okay, we're in stage 1, stage 2, everybody just does it. It's just part of living here. I think there are very few cities in Texas that are like that with water, and I would say almost none of them are like that about energy. So I think explaining to people why you need to do it and why, I think there, I could get into a political conversation on this, but the collective, we have to start functioning a little bit more on the collective, and that didn't go very well during COVID, but this notion of, you can keep your air conditioner at 71 if you want, but you're going to potentially bring down your ability to turn on your air conditioning at all. So a little bit on the front end would help things. I'm a terrible person to talk to because in the summertime, my AC is at 79, mostly because I'm cheap and I came from, my kinfolk are also cheap. So that's just how we roll. But no, I think there could be a lot more education, particularly on peak shaving. So this notion that on those really, really high days, it is critical that we just step it down. And I'm talking like everybody changing their thermostat from 71 to 75. I'm not saying everybody has to come up to me to 79, but if a lot of people do that, it shaves a ton of load, which can really make the difference between going through what we went through or not. So I personally would rather have a slightly hotter or colder house for a few days than have no power for much longer. So I guess I would say, don't think of the winter storm and what happened as a fluke. Any other questions? All right, y'all made it easy on me. There is, if you're bored and you want to read more, there's some, I missed some, sorry. It came in faster. I think I asked all those. I think I answered all those. If there's one I'm missing, let me know. But I tried to work those in as I was talking. There's an art, if you want to read more, you can Google my bio. I wrote a very long policy argument or paper on this. There's also, it's called Energy Water Nexus in Texas. We were very excited that we rhyme. That's the one that I helped write with University of Texas, and it goes much more into the cooling technology, but is very easy to understand. That report is 10 years old, but my co-author and I always laugh that never have I written anything that had those long legs, because everything that's in there is still true. So it's still a valuable thing if you want to read more. Is all the water used by the energy generators purified? No, not at all. So water that is used for power plants is not pre-treated. It's just pulled directly out of the surface water body and then put directly back in. It doesn't actually require any treatment on the back end because it's just been cooked. The problem with that, if you're thinking of it from a natural resources standpoint, is that we actually don't want, kind of boiled water. Fish don't want to live in hot water, but also it kills a lot of the healthy microbes. It can change the dissolved oxygen levels and things like that. But no, there's no treatment for power. All the treatment is for our usage. Oh, sorry. Rainwater harvesting is, that could be a whole other topic. Right now, rainwater harvesting on a household basis or a real disaggregated basis makes the most sense. When you start thinking about large rainwater collection systems as a water source for cities, it is very difficult because of the amount of treatment to ensure consistent quality that is going to everyone's homes. And we don't want to be too reliant on it, at least in certain areas, because if it's not raining and there's a drought, rainwater doesn't help us either. So it's kind of sort of a related issue. It's not, in my mind, a silver bullet. I know some people really advocate for it. I think the best use for me for rainwater harvesting is outdoor watering. I think it's a great opportunity for that because it alleviates the amount of treated water that's going out on the lawn. If you want to talk about wasteful, for those of you who travel, the notion, and particularly if you're going to third world countries, that we're putting drinking water quality standard water on grass is crazy to a lot of people. So for me, it's about alleviating the burden on the water utilities by reducing outdoor watering and using the rainwater harvesting there. That's sort of, instead of trying to capture the rainwater and then treat it and then pump it back out. I honestly don't know how to answer the ERCOT question. I'm sure internally they think they're doing that. I will say that there was no real movement in the legislature to force a major redo of ERCOT. So I don't know how to answer that question. I hope they're doing more than I'm aware of. Let me say that. Do energy generators have a prior right over agriculture? It depends. If it's a surface water right, the way we do surface water in Texas is it's a first come, first served system. So there are energy generators that have very old, valuable permits that would be a quote better permit. They would get water before other users. One of the big things that happened in 2011 was a realization that there were a lot of agricultural interests that had stronger water rights than power generation, which meant that if you sort of extrapolate that out, it meant that there was the potential that ag users could pull water out of surface water bodies and power plants would have to shut down because there wasn't enough water for both. There was Texas Commission on Environmental Quality tried to pass a rule that would have prioritized power plants and municipal water users. That's illegal under our system. They lost in court. So the answer is, some energy providers have very good surface water rights and some don't. And so then that asks the question of, okay, well, going into the future, if we have another 2011, which we 100% will, what do we do? And the answer is it's going to have to be handled through the markets. It's possible that a city or a power provider could pay an agricultural interest not to use their surface water rights so that they then would have enough water to use it. So it's kind of complicated and it overlaps directly with water law and water rights. You know, I mean, mine is also set at 65, Molly, so I'm with you on that. I mean, I would say that what's more important than you being even more cold are the people that have it at 76 or 79 and they're walking around their house in the freezing cold and in sweat, you know, in shorts and a t-shirt. There's going to be a lot more impact for peak shaving if everybody that has it at 77 or 78 goes down to 74 than you going lower than 65. So it really is, you know, during the power shortage, I had mine on 60 because I was so afraid of the bill because I was somewhere that I knew the bills were going to be outrageous. So it's really more about, I mean, if you think about in a cold event or, you know, in air conditioning, it's going to take a lot more energy on a very cold day to get a house from, you know, up to 70 something than it is to get it to 65. So if you're already that low, you're probably actually, it's not cutting on that often would be my answer on that. Anyone else? I also think as a side note that it's not just people making a decision that they don't want to do it. We're terrible at communicating that we need people to cut power. So there's first of all, there's the issue of educating of why they need to do it before the time comes. But then, you know, we have these and we carry them everywhere and then we rarely use them for these types of events that say everybody needs to be no more, you know, shut your this down and that down. So we're also terrible about asking people to do that. Cities that have water conservation, drought restrictions, they usually have really good systems in place because they're doing that every single summer. So, you know, ERCOT or local power providers really need to communicate much, much more frequently with their customers for these things. Yes, I'm glad I have ski clothes too. I mean, one of the things that really struck me during the power outage was, and when there were people that were underneath blankets that were dying of hypothermia, was realizing that I'm very, very privileged to have really good gear. So my blankets are real fabrics, right? Like they're real wool and things like that that keep you warm. Whereas an average Texan or a low income person might have a blanket, but it might not be made of anything that's really going to keep them very warm. So that was something that I thought about quite a bit. Reservoirs are a big battle. We have quite a bit of, is Leah making herself known? My dog has woken up. She's still kind of a puppy. She was a COVID puppy. So she's actually, if we'd had this a year ago, you'd get to watch me playing tug of war with her, but she's waking up. So it's like having a toddler. Reservoirs are highly contentious. First of all, they submerge good land. So if you look at where most of the reservoirs are in East Texas, they're in the hard land forests, the hardwoods, and we don't really want to lose some of those old forests. The other issue is when you think about reservoirs in South Texas, where the reservoirs are going to be very big and very shallow, you have very high evaporation rates, and they often will silt up and become not useful very, very quickly. So reservoirs are really helpful when you have deep caverns, so you have water going down instead of across, because you don't lose that much evaporation and you're not submerging people's land. So if you're going to build a reservoir, you have to condemn all of that property. You know, you're going to massively impact wildlife and things like that. So you need to be very thoughtful about reservoirs. There was a big push for more reservoirs about 7 or 8 years ago. And most of those were found to not be good ideas. They're also outrageously expensive. But that one I think is less of an issue because I think all our future water will be very expensive. And somebody is asking about desal plants. Desalination is absolutely going to be part of the equation. If you're talking about desalinating seawater and then moving it all the way up, that has probably the largest energy footprint that we can think about. Both in terms of getting the water clean and then the coast is downhill from here. If they're talking where we're seeing the most desal is in brackish groundwater, so not water that isn't as saline as saltwater, ocean water. So it creates less, it costs less to clean it, and then it's used locally. So we use brackish water in San Antonio, for example, that is from the Carrizo Wilcox, which is right here. So if you're talking about desal, it's certainly going to be part of the equation. But if you're, as I mentioned, my suggestion that we need to be thinking about the energy footprint of all of our water projects, be prepared for that one to be a very large energy footprint. Yeah, I think that's right. So the prime reservoir areas have already been used. That's absolutely true. A lot of that was built out over the 50s. One place that we see reservoirs that have sort of less of an issue is they're called Onside Reservoirs. So instead of damming a river at the end and having it build up, you actually put it to the side of a river. So that can be helpful in high flow events, that you sort of fill it during those flows. That can be a bit more useful, and folks feel like for in-stream flows and things like that, it's better. Dams have huge, a traditional reservoir is going to be a dammed river, and it has very large, in addition to eating a lot of land, it has really affects downstream quality for fish and wildlife. So we have to think about all of those as well. So no easy answers. My solution is that, what works in one area or what makes sense in one area of Texas will not make sense in another. Texas is significantly different throughout the state, both climatically, topography, population. So we have to think about these things in a much more holistic level and think about not just the water aspect, but the energy and natural impacts as well at the same time. Again, we're not that great at doing that. ASRs is a good one. So ASRs, aquifer storage and recovery is a good one. It's essentially an underground reservoir, which makes a whole lot more sense. The trick with ASRs is locating the ASR. The water doesn't necessarily stay where you want it. It might go downstream and pop up on the ground. So if you can find good places for ASR, there's really no downside. It's just about locating them effectively, and then making sure it can create some problems with Texas water law because of groundwater law. You need to make sure that someone's not just going to put a pump down and grab all the water that you spent millions of dollars putting down there for your use at a later time. So there's some accounting that needs to be done, but ASRs are pretty good. Solar on parking lots, I think there's much more photovoltaic opportunities. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it's a good one. There's developments with nanotechnology of putting solar in paint. And so that would charge that house up, which would really alleviate some of the power on the grid. So I think this disaggregation of power needs is really helpful for peak shaving. If you have the opportunity, like my house is completely shaded, which is a blessing to have huge trees, but it means I can't put solar panels on my roof. That said, some of the things that we're seeing with like Walmarts and these large big box stores where they're putting in sunlights. So, just putting in some natural light massively reduces the amount of power that you need to light these very large areas. And then they're using the rooftops for solar collection for the summertime. So if we think about our future and reducing power, needing to build out more of the grid to require more water, that's a great way to do it. Would the request to reduce power be more effective if a warning of the consequences? Human behavior is something that I've stopped trying to predict after the last 2 years. I think it's less about in that moment giving dire predictions and more about teaching it during the normal time frame. So, we should be thinking about teaching children this relationship, because children are the best at coming home and flipping off switches and making their parents recycle and all that kind of stuff. So, I've just seen, just through my own experience, that sending doom and gloom messages just makes people mad. They feel like it's not their problem. Why isn't the grid or the city providing them water? I mean, the backlash on things like CPS, San Antonio's energy provider, after the winter storm is a perfect example. There was literally nothing CPS could have done. ERCOT was telling them to shut everything down or we were going to lose the grid. There's not much to do at that point. So I think it's really about educating people all the time so that when we have the requests, they understand that they're part of the solution. But I'm certainly open to other ideas. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Amy. I think everybody's floored and will be thinking about this for a while.
Sorry.
My friend down the block said, I wish I hadn't sold all my camping gear during the freeze.
No, you never know when you might need it.
I mean, we forget that the people that first came to Texas were wearing wool clothing year round and had no air conditioning. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have air conditioning till I was in high school, but it wasn't as hot. And also we were just more used to it. It was, much, I don't know if I would want to deal with that now. I'm not sure I'd want to deal with that now. I mean, we don't even build houses. If you live in an older home, they're designed for, those things. But newer homes, they're not insulated. They're not built, these really, really, if you have a vaulted ceiling home, none of that makes sense for hot days because if you have a great room, for example, you're air conditioning that entire room. They never would have built houses like that before air conditioning. So,
and sometimes you can't even open the windows.
Yeah, exactly. People freak out at me because I have my windows open almost as much as humanly possible, and nobody wants to do that. But I mean, it saves a lot of money, and I prefer the fresh air. So,
well, thank you very much. Does anybody have anything else that they want to add? Oh, appreciate your coming through for us. Thank you so much.
No problem. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Go play with this dog before she makes me crazy. Let's see, I lost her. I don't even know where she is. That's never a good sign.
We thank you, everybody, for attending this last meeting of the year. Thank you, Amy. That was excellent. I learned a whole lot. I just never associated the two subjects together. So
You're not alone.
We appreciate it. Everybody have a very happy holiday, and we will see you next year at the next chapter meeting. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.